Gathered here today on February 18th, 2024, the Assembly of Buddha Eye Temple humbly enacts these rites of offering for our original teacher and great turner of the wheel of Dharma in this world, Shakyamuni Buddha. May our reverence for his embodiment find expression in how we live and care for and with all beings. There is something each of us will do alone. Goodbye is painful. Hearts are meant to break, open as the sky, body bright and still. Appetites of fire on full display. No opposing space beyond guides us through this single passage just once, as every instance slipping through our hands. Roll. A tiny plum tree dares to flower. The pale, gentle, generous moon hangs low to the horizon. Show me how to live.
am thought extinction to always seeing me. Their hearts become selfish and arrogant, dissolute and set on the five desires. They would fall into evil destinies. I always know which living beings practice the way in which do not in accord with what their salvation requires. I give voice to the various teachings I ever make this my thought. How can I cause the living beings to enter into the unsurpassed way and promptly embody Buddha?
Body of the pure Dharma world, originally unborn, yet appearing in all times through the vow of compassion. We look to the brilliant light of wisdom and humbly ask for the teachings of the true Dharma. Having offered tea, cake, sweet water, flowers, light, and incense, and having recited the verse of the lifespan chapter of the inconceivable Dharma Lotus Sutra, we offer the merit to our great benefactor and original teacher who passed into final nirvana on this day, the great sage of the Shakya clan. Dai Hon Kyoshi Hanshi Shakyamuni Buddha Tai Hosho. We pray that the light of Nirvana universally shine, that the mysterious merit of perfect wisdom be practiced and verified, that the eternal abiding be made manifest, and that we gain the final victory of the sage of this world together with all living beings. Zazen.
Hojo.
Sokai.
Sokai.
Tojun. Susan.
Kogan.
Kogan.
Genki.
Genki.
Myeolbun,
Myeolbun.
Yuton,
Yuton. Anyu. Dokyu. Reiko. Togen. Joen. Segan. Hamish. Kosei. Jikie. Kisei. Joshin. Leo. Gigan. Sanya. Tanya. Alexis. Laura. Anne. Jacob. Carrie. Novon. Emmanuel. Corinne. Barbara. Christopher. Jeffrey. Anshin. Eider. Trevor. Danchin. Carol. June. Sam. Patty. Ray. Nancy. Seizen. Jinkaku. Darren. Kosen. Robert. Bryn. Anna. Will. Mario. Ethan. Matthias. TC. Onchin. Andre. Jason. Jessa. Audrey. Joichi. Don. Suiho. Linda. Mason.
And on the Ngawa? Aiden. Great. Good morning.
Morning.
You ready to talk about death?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
So the past couple of weeks, we had ceremonies that were a little bit longer than normal. So the Zazen time has been a little bit shorter. So I have two things to say about that. You can always come earlier, and there's full period of Zazen from 9 o'clock. So if you do thirst for like a nice long sit, which is a good thing, please try coming at 9, and there's always a 40-minute sit at that time, and then sometimes later it gets, I think today was 5 minutes or something like that, same as last week. But, so that's the first thing I said. Second thing is, in Zazen there is no time. One period of Zazen is not 40 minutes. Right? We make that mistake. It's for convention. The old way was 1 stick of incense. So there's an old saying that says 1 stick of incense is 1 stick of incense Buddha. So you're Buddha for the burning of 1 stick of incense. Then, we mess it up. But not to think too much about time is actually really important in practice of Zazen, or seated meditation. In fact, you can take up the practice of really purposely throwing time out. It takes a little bit of preparation. One way is to come to the temple and someone else is doing the time, right? And then you just throw it out. And I used to say to myself, when I was a young monk, and I would say to myself, the bell will never ring. Because I wanted the bell to ring really bad. So I would say to myself, the bell will never ring, and try to just engage the foreverness of the moment, which is very challenging. That's one of the things that kind of drives us to all of our habitual neuroses, is that the eternity of the moment is, that sounds all nice, like what's that guy talking about, what's the God, Kermit the Frog guy? Eckhart Tolle. They sorry, that was so nice. Sounds great and all, but actually it's a little treacherous. Sorry, that wasn't nice. So just kind of go with the time. And this comes into our what I'd like to talk about this morning a little bit, which is the total openness of the sky of death. And today is a day that we commemorate the passing of Shakyamuni Buddha into Parinirvana. Parinirvana means perfect nirvana or complete nirvana. It's a way of referring to the dissolution of his physical body in this world. And the revealing of another kind of body. And every year I feel very challenged by this this celebration or this commemoration or this teaching, because loss is very difficult. And those of you who have lost, which is really all of us in different ways, you know the pain of that. To say goodbye, forever is one of the most important and difficult things that we do. Absence is revealed in the passing of a life. It's an absence that we prefer not to see too much. So we spend most of our observational capacities paying attention to what is, and paying attention to the absence of is not what we're inclined to. But death opens up a passageway there for us, where paying attention to the space is just as important as paying attention to the presence of a being, of a thing. There's a threshold, there's a passage, there's a doorway, a well, in some ways a fountain, that is revealed in a being's passing, if we pay attention. It's a passageway, or it's a threshold to the beyond. And the beyond is not, it doesn't mean gone. It doesn't mean absent in like a negation of. It means that there's a different body that is revealed, and that body can't be grasped in the same way that we can pretend to grasp these physical bodies. I say pretend because we can't grasp these bodies, but we've convinced ourselves that we can. Mm-hmm. So we act as if we know who other beings are, that they're there inside the silhouette of their flesh, and we kind of isolate ourselves and other beings from this vast body that we all are all the time. In the Buddhist lingo, sometimes we call that the unborn, this beyond. Sometimes we call it nirvana. So this is why we talk about the Buddha's death, not as the Buddha's death, but as the Buddha's parinirvana. So we don't really say death, although he died, okay? But we usually use the term parinirvana because it's talking about this threshold. Usually when we think about death, we think just something's been eliminated. Right? But here when we say parinirvana, it's referring to this threshold, which we all can become aware of. We particularly can become aware of it through loss, through someone's death. One of my favorite teachings, it's common that a teacher, they're teaching longer and longer, and we get a little tired, and then we just start saying the same thing over and over. I apologize. It's been spun as a good thing by the ancestors, but they all did that, so I'm not really sure if it's good or it's just what they were doing, so it was. So many of you have heard this many, many, many times, and I have a feeling that you're going to hear this a lot more times, and this might be just the thing I just, every time I give a talk, I just read this. Okay? So listen to it carefully. You can forget it because you're likely to hear it again. This comes from the Questions of Milanda, which is one of a very, very ancient text in which this king Milanda is asking questions about the Dharma, and this is a teaching that's given to him. The question is, what is nirvana? Just as space is not produced, does not age, does not suffer death, does not pass out of existence, does not come into existence, cannot be forcibly handled, cannot be carried away by thieves, rests on nothing, is the pathway of birds, presents no obstacles, is endless. So also nirvana is not produced, does not age, does not suffer death, does not pass out of existence, does not come into existence, cannot be forcibly handled, cannot be carried away by thieves, rests on nothing, is the pathway of the noble, presents no obstacles, is endless. So when we talk about this perfect nirvana, this complete nirvana of the Buddha, it's not negation. It is this kind of freedom, something which cannot be forcibly handled. Think about how death presents that to you. When you draw close to death, you realize that there's something you can't do anything. You have to shift from doing to appreciating. There's a passageway in your being which knows, oh, actually to care for things is not to meddle with them, but to treasure them. And if you've learned to love, could be in many different ways. Love's a pretty big word. You've learned to care for. You can draw to that threshold, and then you can know something that's very difficult to know in any other way. In the verse of the lifespan, which we read this morning, that's a sutra, or a part of a sutra that we read here at Buddha Eye every morning. It's part of the traditional liturgy of Soto Zen temples for the morning service. And if you listen to it, it's quite an interesting chapter. It's my favorite, really. I say that about a lot of chapters of the Lotus Sutras. But to set the scene for you, what happens is, in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha is about to preach the Lotus Sutra, which is this great fractal quality of that particular sutra. Is the sutra is about the Buddha preaching the sutra that's about him preaching the sutra. It's like this spiral that's feeding back on itself. Right? And so in the sutra, he's about to teach the Lotus Sutra, and these wonderful things happen. This great treasure stupa, jeweled stupa, rises from the ground up into the sky, and all these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas from all possible worlds gather together, and the sutra opens, and the Buddha shares the seat with the Buddha that's outside of the stupa, and then the ground splits open, and this uncountable number of Bodhisattvas pour out from the ground and fill up all of the space. Anyway, if you like that kind of thing, I highly recommend the Lotus Sutra. If you don't like that thing, I highly recommend that kind of thing. I highly recommend the Lotus Sutra. It will maybe break you open a little bit. Your imaginal mind, your capacity to conceive of worlds that are not limited to this, is really on full display in the Lotus Sutra. And so through that process, this question arises in one of the Buddha's students, because the Buddha says, well, who are these bodhisattvas? And he says, oh, well, they're my students. They've been in the space underneath the earth for uncalculable amount of time. And then his student says, well, but you're only, like 45. How can you have all these students, right? How can you have all of these students that have been there forever, or he didn't really say forever, but like uncalculable time, and you're just this person of 45. And then the Buddha says, oh, you don't understand who I am. You don't understand what a Buddha is. You mistake this limited fleshy body for the body of a Buddha, and that is the body of a Buddha, but it's not, you're misunderstanding what's happening. You're only looking at what's here. You're not looking at the space. You're only looking at the physically embodied. You're not looking at the embodied, which is completely partaking of the interbeing of all things. You think that I stop at the silhouette of my flesh. Right? But that's not who I am. Right? A Buddha is not that. Is not limited to that. And so in this chapter, then he starts to teach about that. And he talks about it in terms of space, and he talks about it in terms of time. We won't go into the space too much today, but the line there where he says, I abide on sacred Vulture Peak and every other dwelling place. It's a very interesting line. Okay? I abide on sacred Vulture Peak. That's where he teaches the Lotus Sutra. You can visit there. I've never been there. I hope to go someday. In India, you can go. Most people I talk to said it's kind of anticlimactic because it's like, Vulture Peak! And then you go there and it's like, oh, Vulture Peak. It's like, Vulture Skinner's Butte, you know, kind of like, maybe Spencer's Butte? Skinner's Butte, yeah, not Spencer's Butte, Skinner's Butte. Anyway, oh, you know those rock columns over on the side of Skinner Butte? We could retool those. We can get someone to turn into a Buddha. That's the place to get it. Anyway, I always do this. So he's there, and that's where he teaches the Lotus Sutra, okay? So he's saying, yeah, I abide here. You can see me here. But I also abide in every other dwelling place. Notice he doesn't say everywhere. This is really important. The language of the Lotus Sutra is precise. He doesn't say, I abide on sacred Vulture Peak and everywhere. He says, I abide on sacred Vulture Peak and every other dwelling place. Each place, as opposed to all place. You know, like this kind of universalization. He says, at the center of anything which you could identify as be a place of abiding, this heart of awakening is there. It's not a thing that crushes all of the separate places and turns them into one. It is something which doesn't oppose oneness and eachness, that those things are true at the same time. There's a center to the circle, there's a circle, and there's all the space outside and inside the circle. Now, when we're talking about that in spatial relationships, right, it's a little woo-woo, but you kind of can get it. Now take that same thing and say time is the same deal. But our problem with time is we don't you can't walk north and then walk south and then walk east and then walk west in time. At least we don't do it very consciously. I have a feeling we're actually doing it, but we don't have, it's not so easy for us to recognize that's what's happening. We're mostly just like one straight liners, right? We're like, what were those guys? The north going Sacs and the south going, remember that?
Dr. Seuss?
Dr. Seuss, yeah, the north going Sacs and the south going Sacs, and then they run into each other, and then they think, yeah. So that's kind of how we are with time. We're just like, this is the direction I'm going, that's all it is. If you pay attention, it gets a little weirder than that, okay? And the Buddha then talks about how it's a little bit weirder than that. That same principle, I abide on sacred Vulture Peak, is also true in time. Right? Although I'm here right now, that doesn't exclude that in each time I am also present. It's not only spread out through space, but it's also spread out through time. And we're confused because we see the material body, the visible body, present for a certain length of time. We become very attached to that. And then at the dissolution of that, we think that it's just negation. But he's saying, no, the fact of this period of time of life is just what it is. And it's not opposed to all the other times of life. Just like however big your body is not opposed to all of the places that aren't your body, your physical body. But we have a kind of habit of thinking that way. So this is an introduction for him to be teaching about what the Dharma body is, as opposed to what the response body is. So the response body of the Buddha, in a kind of Buddhist theology or Buddhist teaching, is the Buddha that shows up in response to people's needs. I don't know if you've noticed, but humans have a tendency to make a mess of things. And so the response body of the Buddha appeared in our world to respond to the teaching that we needed. That Dharma body responds, and it responds in very specific ways to specific circumstances. And so the theology or the story or the legend is that the Shakyamuni Buddha purposely took birth in this world to respond to our needs. I mean, he was hanging out in the Tushita heaven, which is like the heaven of complete contentment. Think about that, right? That's where it's said that all Buddhas live before they're reborn in a world to become a Buddha. While they're still bodhisattvas, when they've come to the peak of their spiritual journey, they are born in this heavenly realm of total contentment. And they stay there for kalpas until they're thoroughly, like their consciousness is thoroughly purified of wanting to mess with anything. And that's when they're ready to show up into a world of suffering and to be awakened. That's very interesting. That's not the end point, right? That's like a very important place. But the place where you have to become a Buddha, you have to be in response. You have to be in response to suffering. And what the Dharma body, this vast, ungraspable body, shows up as a very particular, ungraspable body. And that very particular, ungraspable body can teach. Now this is true of a Buddha, and this is true of bodhisattvas, and we are all also bodhisattvas. So this is true of our lives as well. In the traditional image of Parinirvana, which someday we will have here at Buddha Eye, every year I've been looking for the right painting, and I found some Tonka painters. So we could get one from Japan, but we have to have a very big fundraiser, because the painters in Japan, it maybe takes a year or a couple of years to paint one, and so that you have to think about what that is. There are some painters from Tibetan traditions who painting Tonkas that are very nice. That maybe we could have smaller fundraiser. Well, anyway, we'll leave that for later. But usually the ones that come from Tibetan tradition are different. And that's okay, I'm open to that, but they're usually missing something to me which is really important in the East Asian Parinirvana scrolls about Parinirvana, about the Buddha's passing. And so the image there is the Buddha is lying down on his right side with his arm underneath his head for a pillow, and he's between two sal trees, which is also where he was born, there with his mother clutching the branch of a sal tree. And he's very peaceful. He knows that it's time for him to die. And his disciples have gathered around, and all manner of bodhisattvas from various realms and wheel-turning kings, they're referred to, have all gathered. The skies have opened up, and many celestial beings have come, including his mother, Maya, who's usually right in the center. She's depicted. If you think about that, of a mother losing her child, her presence there will open something up for you. And then below, many of his disciples kind of weeping and tearing at their bodies because they're so overcome with grief. And then all manner of animals that have come to honor the Buddha. And it's this beautiful mandala of the Buddha there in the center in perfect tranquility, opening up this doorway or revealing the threshold. And all of these myriad beings present in this circle around the Buddha, each with their own reaction to the Buddha's passing. Some know exactly what's going on, and they're sitting in a kind of a knowing contentment. And others know exactly what's going on, and they're bawling, right? And I don't really think one's better than the other. I love this image because it is a really core image of the Mahayana, or the great vehicle. Our interdependence is actually a constant coming and going. Now, when we hear about interbeing, for example, the great teacher Thich Nhat Hanh teaches about interbeing so much. Many of you may be familiar with that. His most famous teaching, you say, if you're reading this book and it's printed on paper, and if you were a poet, I love how he says this in the original book. He says, if you were a poet, you would see that. The whole world is here in this piece of paper. For the paper to be there had to be a tree. For the tree to be there, the sun and the rain and the earth and the person who made the paper, etc., and you can follow it out. Okay? Now this is just interbeing on a kind of physically described level, but you can see that on that physically described level there is a principle that's very important, is that our interbeing is always coming and going. The piece of paper is no longer the tree. If you look into the paper with the eyes of a bodhisattva, you will see that this paper and the tree are not separate. But you can't exactly see the tree because the tree has gone and the paper has come. So this cyclical existence, this being born and dying, that's called samsara, cyclical, it's happening again and again. In many types of Buddhism, that is seen as a problem. And that the solution to that problem is to extinguish the sources of that coming and going. And that's what nirvana is. But in the Mahayana, we take a slightly different approach. We say that the samsara and nirvana are not separate things. Maybe we could just say it's attitude adjustment, right? Yeah. A big attitude adjustment. So samsara, this coming and going, all of these beings there around the Buddha, which completely share in the heart of the Buddha. That's what that threshold is the revelation, I abide on Sacred Vulture Peak and every other dwelling place, in the heart of every being that is dwelling there in that mandala and out into the universe. That the extinction of nirvana is not the extinction of life, it's the extinction of afflictions. Nirvana, that scholars debate a little bit about the origin of that word, but they all agree that it means something about like blowing out a fire. The debate is like, what's the fire, right? So something people think the fire is just living, but that's actually not Buddhism. There's what we lump a lot of different spiritual paths under the term Hinduism. So I don't like to use that term because it's not fair to those different devotees of different places. But there is one form of that type of thinking where life is a problem, and actually being able to end life is seen as the salvation. But that's not the Buddhist teaching. Buddhist teaching is not about the extinction of life. It's about the extinction of afflictions. And the extinction of the afflictions allows us to see that living, dying, the wholeness of the mandala is the serenity of the Buddha there at that threshold. And nirvana and samsara are not in opposition. The things that we can see, the bodies we can be, and encounter other beings, those bodies are not a problem. It's just that we transfix on them. We need to get reminded about being transfixed. And it's no problem because we all get to die. Now, I want to warn you about something. This samsara and nirvana not being separate, this is not just a description. I said that this is the Mahayana, the great vehicle. It's a vehicle, not an ontological description. It becomes a poisonous teaching when it is held on to just as a description of reality. Right? And the reason it becomes poisonous is because it's the perfect excuse to do whatever you want, really. Oh, samsara is nirvana. Rock on. Right? I'm just going to fully engage the samsara. And you just, everything goes flat. But this is ignoring that threshold. And the nice thing is you can only do it for so long, because that kind of rock-on attitude will bring you to the edge of your capacities, and stuff will fall apart, and you'll be miserable, and you'll go, oh, maybe I misunderstood, right? So it's, it's a poison, but, a lot of things are. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is focus on the vehicle part. The great vehicle, the Mahayana, is not the description of a way that the world is. It's an invitation to a way of living and dying, and living and dying, which is not cyclical in the way that we usually experience these cycles of karma. So at the Buddha's teaching at Parinirvana, there are different things that get pointed out. What did he teach? The text that's usually used in the Soto school is called like the Buddha's teachings at Parinirvana, is focused to his renunciate students. So the whole sutra is about how they practice as renunciates. So when we read it not as renunciates, it's kind of challenging, because it's all these things that are like, you're like, how do you live? Well, the way you live that way is you be a renunciate. But he's just reminding them, and the main thing he reminds them about is the rules of renunciate living. Okay, parimoksha is what it's called in Sanskrit. So it's the rules that define the behavior of a renunciate follower of the Buddha. So that pratimoksha teaching is great. The main reason I'm bringing it up now is because it's about a path. It's about the vehicle of this non-separation, not just a description. The one that also gets brought up a lot is called the 8 Teachings of Great Beings. This is the teaching that Dogen Zenji, the founder of our school, puts in front of the assembly around the Buddha's death. And he says these are the things that a great being, i.e. a Buddha or a Bodhisattva, should know and practice. And I'll just read them to you. The first one is few desires. I'm so thankful that he wrote few on front of them. There's a lot of wiggle room in few. Few desires. My wife brings that one up to me a lot. She doesn't know almost any Buddhist teachings at all. I don't know how she learned that one, but she will say, she kind of teases me. She says, "Hey Joe, few desires." No satisfaction, not N-O satisfaction, but to know. This is the second one. To know satisfaction. Yeah. To be intimate with it. I heard this great thing on the radio yesterday. I don't know if anyone was listening to the radio yesterday. I was kind of driving, doing some errands, and it was on, and so it was about this science. It was a Science Friday, maybe like that, and I just tuned in this one part where a man was talking about when he was a boy and how his father taught him, and he said he would always take me to the woods, and we would see all kinds of birds in the woods. And his father spoke many, many different languages. And so he would say, oh, you see that? In English, that's called a varied thrush. And in Chinese, it's called whatever it's called in Chinese. And in Spanish, it's called this. And he would tell them all the names of this thing. And then he said, my father turned to me and he said, I want you to realize you do not know birds. You know the names of birds. To know a bird is something else. And he said this was kind of the way his father trained him. He said, did you notice how the thrush did this? Or did you notice how the thrush did that? You have to come back to the woods over and over again. And then you could talk about knowing the thrush. But to know the name is not the point. Well, that's so great. So knowing the name satisfaction, it's pretty good. There's some songs about it. But to know it, that's a practice, right? It's a practice of saying, no, I'm going to let myself feel the satisfaction that's possible here. Take from within the realm of what is given. That's Dogen's instruction about how to know satisfaction. To enjoy quiet. To be diligent in your exertion in the way. To practice mindfulness. This mindfulness is a little bit different maybe than what oftentimes is brought up as mindfulness. Here it means like make sure you're paying attention to what you're doing. or not doing, right? Which is kind of the same thing, but a little different. Meditation, cultivate wisdom. And my favorite and my biggest challenge, do not enjoy frivolous talk. That one cuts. So, I'm not going to go into those teachings, but I wanted to show them to you because these are all an outcome of encountering that threshold. The Buddha's passing into Parinirvana is an invitation to a way of living. You know, like when you really encounter death, the practice of knowing satisfaction is the only way you're going to get through it. You got to grieve. And a lot of that grieving is preparing you, is teaching you how to know to be satisfied with what has been given. And not to live in the world of, well, what if this could have been this way or that could have been that way? It could have been a little bit longer, you know. Trapping the person who's passing through that passageway in some idea of something different. This is where ghosts come from. Okay? I say that not as a joke. Like, this is how beings get trapped. You know? They get trapped in our idea of what they are. And so our practice is both for our life to live through that passageway and to dedicate that also to their continual aliveness. Loss teaches us to live. And that's a basic kind of principle. No, I've told this story many times before, but I think the last teaching which I heard, Kyogen Carlson Roshi, founder of Dharma Rain Zen Center and one of the founding teachers of this temple, one of the last teachings, or I think maybe the last teaching I heard him give before he passed away in 2014, was about death. And the thing he said a lot of things, but the thing that really stuck with me and I remember again and again, he said it's very important for people to die well. And he said, he was particularly talking about elders, but not only elders die. Right? So he said it's important for people to die well. And the reason is not to give an example for other people to die well, although that's important. But we need to die well so that the living can live well. And this is a conundrum, you know. It's not just a rational thing, but it's about this threshold that the dying well teaches us about living. And so my encouragement to you, both in relationship to the founder of this path and this world, Shakyamuni Buddha, but really in all manner of loss and death. Don't shut the door. I mean, there actually isn't a door on the threshold. So you can't really shut it, but you can spend a lot of time trying to imagine a door and trying to shut it. And it will seem like it's there, and then it breaks open. So there's another possibility. And all of the kind of practices... It's okay. Yeah, we'll just end with that. Have a little time if there's any questions or comments.
Hey.
Oh.
So at the end of the faith in mind,
Yeah.
no past, no future, no present.
Yeah.
What relationship does that have?
Yeah, I love that line. It's one of another sutra, or it's technically a sastra, is written by the third ancestor of Zen in China, as a kind of teaching poem. And at the end, the very last line is what Kogen's referring to. It says, there's no past, no future. And you kind of, usually when you first read it, you think like, okay, yeah, no past and no future. But then the last thing it says, no present. Mm-hmm. And this is really important teaching. It's this exact teaching that when we're thinking about no past and no future, that one we can get our head around pretty easily. We say, well, the past is gone, and there's all these things that happened, or we should say the results of all these things happened right now, but there really isn't anything there anymore. Right? And the future hasn't come yet. So then we try to live in this sandwiched present, right? But that sandwiched present, if you pay attention to it, is just like, it's that threshold. It's that moment that I was talking about at the beginning, our own discomfort with the expanse of the present moment. There's no thing there. There's nothing sandwiched between later and before. There's just the whole sky. And that's where that third ancestor, I think that's the most precise line in the verses of Faith Mind. There's so many great teachings in there, but I think that one's the most precise.
Well, in terms of the present, I had some experience which I won't go into, but
Yeah.
we've talked about, and it seems to me there is no present, and certainly what we think of as present has to include memory, and that seems to be what happened.
Yeah.
And that I I haven't pursued that, how that relationship is, but it seems clear to me.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
Without memory, we don't know
Yeah.
what's happening in the moment, so there is no present.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If you don't have memory to be able to orient yourself in what's happening now,
Exactly.
then you can't make sense of what's happening now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. Thank you.
Hey.
Can you say more about dying well? I'm not sure we have a lot of choice about what the very end of our lives are going to look like, so yeah, just say more about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So the reason that the dying well teaches to live well is because it's facing the same ungraspability. And that's not like a, what would be the word? That's not like a cookie cutter, like this is the picture of what dying well is, and this is the picture of what not dying well is. But it's about that practice, which is based on a conviction to meet the expanse as opposed to turn away from it. And we will all have our own karma as we draw towards death, and it will create, it's possible will create a lot of difficulties and complexities. It's likely it will create difficulties and complexities. And in those difficulties and complexities, we see the face of this boundless thing which is not under our control. Are we gonna actually face that, or are we gonna just kind of push against it, just complain about it, wish that it was otherwise, or are we gonna really face what's there? And that's, I think, a great gift that death brings to us, is it helps us to know that conviction of what it means to face something. Not because it's inevitable, although it is, but because it is this possibility of looking through the passage to the beyond. And that gives us a way to live until we're not alive anymore. Yeah. And this is a very different thing than trying to figure out like what happens to us after we die, what happens there. And Buddhism has plenty of teaching on that. And my personal belief is, I don't think this is the first time around or the last time around, and I don't know where the around is. I don't think this is the only place to go around. And so, I think it's a pretty cosmic free-for-all in that realm. But I don't actually care so much about that investigation, It may be revealed to me at some time. Hopefully, in my death, I will have the clarity to be able to see some of that, and I think that will unfold. But to me, it's not the real. It's not the real issue. The real issue is how do we practice. And so I don't dwell too much on that kind of, well, what happens next. I try to dwell right in the practice of it. You know? And on a practical level, for those of you who, when you lose someone, that will happen, pray. I mean, I use that word kind of loosely, but you know, since our daughter's death 7 years ago, I chant the Compassionate Heart Dharani every night, offer incense, and I talk with her. And you know, that saved my life. I mean, it taught me how to live. I mean, it saved my life in the sense of I didn't know how I was going to go on. So there's that kind of saving my life. But there's also the saving my life is like, it was like, oh, actually, there's a way to live through this. Not just with it, but through it. And that comes from not turning away, but turning back to it. Now, when it's a person, I mean, especially someone as beautiful as Satsuki and just so generous, and you know, it's easy to want to just be there. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's your cantankerous, whatever, difficult relationships, all those sorts of things. Doesn't matter. That relationship is still true. It doesn't ever go away because it's located not in the present that goes away. It's located throughout everything. So that's why it's so important to take up those practices and to revisit. And depending on how close the person is to you, how important they are, that, I mean, you know, this is our daughter, right? So it's going to be every day for the rest of my life. I know that's just a given. But it won't be that way for everyone, you know? So some people will be okay for a period of time, or now and again, or when I can visit their grave, I will, or when it's the anniversary of their passing or their birthday or whatever it is. But taking up that, you know, the dedication to turn towards that passing is part of Japanese Buddhism. It's not so much in other schools of Buddhism, but Japanese Buddhism is really promoted. And I questioned that for a long time. I used to just, I can't believe my teacher put up with me. I would just complain about, funeral Buddhism, and why people aren't sitting zazen, and blah, 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 blah. And he would just listen to me, be like, yeah, you're right, da, 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 da. And then one day I was like, oh, my master has spent the last 50 years mostly performing funeral ceremonies and commemoration ceremonies for the members of his temple. He has completely turned his life inside out to do that, and I'm just trash talking it. You know? And then I was like, and then so I said something to him. I kind of apologized, like, oh yeah. Yeah. Shall I be so patient? We'll see.
Sangam Saranam
Any announcements?
Yeah, I was one of your greeters today along with Corinne and Opal. If you're new and you have questions about the temple, we're happy to answer questions or just chat. So you can approach anyone that looks like they know what they're doing. I'm Christopher, by the way.
If you are a term student, please remember that we'll have a term student meeting this afternoon at 12:30 p.m. In the hall.
Eco Dharma group meets on Tuesday at 5:15. Everyone is welcome. If you have any questions about it, you can ask whoever raises their hand right now. You can. Anybody else? Back there. Thank you.
For those with dedication of merit, dedication to the deceased, and dedication to those in distress, please know that those are read in morning service every day. So even though you didn't hear their names today, they'll be read throughout the week.
Sesshin starts on Wednesday. If you're doing it and haven't signed up, sign up.
We have coffee and treats available shortly.